because as soon as they start discussing it, that becomes in the public domain and they run the risk of prosecution. And what I think is interesting is even if we do see an increase, do we necessarily see that as evidence for a slippery slope? I think not. Let's suppose for the moment that eating cornflakes is illegal. And you might really like the idea of eating cornflakes. Now, you can get up in breakfast in the morning, pour your bowl of cornflakes, pour milk on, put some sugar on, fantastic. But you don't do it because it's illegal. And we do a survey, say, how many people, despite it being illegal, eat cornflakes. And you find it's a fairly small number, because we're all good law-abiding citizens. You then pass a law permitting it, and of course what's going to happen? Well, as soon as the law's passed, a few people who've wanted to eat cornflakes will do so. And the people who've wanted to eat cornflakes can now be open about it, so they can tell their friends how nice cornflakes taste. So sure, you're going to see a big increase when you decriminalise something, but this is not entirely surprising. And of course, when we see increases, they may reflect just a trend that was going on anyway. You may actually find sometimes that an increase is still evidence against it. If something was on the increase, so for example in the Dutch example, we don't know whether ending someone's life without actually discussing with them was at the time increasing. And it may be that although someone might claim a further increase, the trend has actually been slowed down. So it may be that the existing trend was high, it is now lower than it used to be. I think we can make a case that says if we're going to really accept a slippery slope, we need to show that not the activity we're dealing with, eating cornflakes, has increased, because we'd expect that. Of course, when it's decriminalised, there's going to be more of it. So it's got to be some other, presumably related activity, and it's an activity that's unacceptable, and that has increased in parallel with the change. And the difficult aspect, of course, is we have to show it was a result of the change. And that is very, very difficult, because we're dealing purely with correlational data, and demonstrating any kind of causal link, as we all know, is very, very difficult. Having said which, it's fairly clear that in some circumstances we don't get them, and one of my favourites is the UK Abortion Act of 1967, which originally permitted abortion up to 28 weeks if the continued pregnancy, and I quote here, involved increased risk to the mental or physical health of the woman. Now, in fact, far from starting a slippery slope, what we find is that subsequently the law has, if anything, become more restrictive for quite good reasons. At the time it was passed in 67, 28 weeks was probably an upper limit on survivability of a fetus. With improvements in medical care, then survivability has come down by several weeks, and so the UK Act has now restricted to 24 weeks. And I think many people would argue that's perfectly logical, perfectly reasonable, and consistent with the original intention of the Act. A few other things where we don't usually hear about slippery slopes, but we might think we could make a good case for them. When we talk about euthanasia, we're talking about people volunteering to die, in effect. We also have other circumstances where we have non-volunteers legally dying. Death penalty is probably the most obvious. Why do we not see, when people are campaigning for the death penalty, someone saying, but if you pass that, next thing you know, it's a slippery slope and we'll be hanging sheep stealers like they did in the Old West? We don't actually see that. Nor do we see people saying, oh, well, if you're going to start killing off criminals, what next? The old, the mentally handicapped, the disabled. But we don't. So the use of a slippery slope argument is often really quite selective. And what we seem to see is that really it's very, very, very difficult to produce good evidence for a slippery slope. And any evidence we have might be so flimsy that it can be, for all practical purposes, regarded as non-existent. Now, if you look up slippery slopes in philosophy textbooks, logic textbooks, and so on, you'll often see it referred to, I think rather nicely, as the slippery slope fallacy, along with naturalistic fallacies and other logical errors. And by and large, I might have not taken that much interest in slippery slopes, but for the fact that some people do still seem not to regard them as fallacious. And in a major paper, this guy Volok, who is a lawyer, wrote about a whole range of mechanisms whereby slippery slopes might work. And we've seen some of these already: attitude change, gradual shifts. Interesting thing is political momentum. Maybe if you pass a law, if you change the law, that will create political momentum for other change. Cost concerns have been raised, and equality and consistency and unexpected outcomes we've referred to before. And I'd just like to look at those in a little bit more detail, particularly this one. Because there's a general feeling that, oh, once we start allowing these things, then we'll get desensitized. The things that we think and we know are horrible and unacceptable, we'll come to feel, oh, maybe they're not so bad anyway. And so once we do that, we become more willing to accept pressure to move further in that direction. And he argues from quite an interesting point of view, I think, this is undesirable because if we support, let's say, changing euthanasia law, then we might support a change up to the point where we say, okay, for things like the Cox case, it's acceptable. But the danger is that other people, when we do this, will change their attitude. And then although we stick to our principles, we find that we've now become outvoted because other people decide that some other course of action is acceptable. And I think this is really interesting, especially coming from somebody in the United States, the home of democracy and the land of the free. Because what it seems to be suggesting is that we should be entirely self-interested, which again might justifiably raise the comments of, so what's new? If we actually break this down, what we are saying is that, okay, the change in the law, if it's producing a widespread change in attitude, is now producing a new society in which the majority, presumably if there's going to be further change, now regards something as acceptable. Now, for us to say, but we don't like it, so therefore we're not going to go ahead with it, is really fundamentally undemocratic and is really largely a self-interested argument. And I'm not sure that from anything other than purely selfish motives, we can actually argue this point of view as a justification for a slippery slope restriction. An interesting suggestion he makes is the so-called gradual shift notion. And we know this, and this actually works. If you want to produce change, don't produce a major change all at once. I personally think it would be great if in New Zealand we had twice as many public holidays, because I like holidays. I'm a firm believer that a bad day on holiday is still better than a good day at work. But if I demand a huge number of extra public holidays, no one will accept it. But if we slowly break in the idea of, well, let's sort of just take one of our existing public holidays, one of the ones that we don't get if it's on a weekend, and just now accept that to be, well, if it falls on a weekend, we'll have an extra day off somewhere else. And people might say, okay, that's sort of acceptable. And then when I've got that, I then start saying, oh, but of course, that really isn't an increase because we always had that one, and we really need more public holidays. So let's look for some, and so on. We'll have Edmund Hillary Day or something. And certainly there's a lot of experimental evidence that people's willingness to change and the extent to which they'll change is greater if you introduce the change a small amount of time than if you present them with a whole change all at once. But I'm not actually sure that this justifies calling a halt before an unacceptable position is reached, for two reasons. One, I think, to use a slippery slope argument is to say we have no other option. We do have an option. We have an option of saying, as we might do if we go to an auction, if I'm putting in a bid for something, write down, this is the maximum I'm willing to go for. When I reach that point, I will stop. And there is absolutely nothing to stop us doing so. It just means to say we have to be a little bit more logical in doing this. We have to resist, as we see in auctions, the temptation to say, oh, it's only a little bit more, and so on. Secondly, I think, again, we've got this whole issue of, well, maybe part of the reason people do this is, again, because they can find that the change isn't as distressing, disturbing, unacceptable as they thought it might be. It's actually turning out to be better. And while it was too frightening in the first instance, the big change, we actually feel able to face it because we've been introduced to it bit by bit. Follock suggests political momentum. I really don't want to spend much time on this. It's a bit like saying, well, okay, if I don't like the National Party and the National Party are in favour of increasing access to euthanasia, I shouldn't vote for it even though I agree with the